السلام عليكم، مرحبا بكم في فيديو جديد، بودكاست جديد. توجور مع ان كرياتور اللي نسيو نجيبو لكم دي كرياتور بارتو من الموند، نحكوا على لي كرياسيون تاعكم تاعهم بلوتو. سمحوا لي اليوم ان كرياتور انتريسون تنومينا واحد من اللي افضل صناع الكوميكس في ماريكان، جون اللي راهم طالعين في لا بيريود الاخرى. قريت كتاباته، قريت ثلاثه لي كرياسيون تاعو، اي سيت نجيبوه لكم ونحكوا على لي كرياسيون تاعو. هالو بورسناك، هابي تو سي يو براذر.
Good to see you. Good to see you. I have no idea what you said, but it sounded very nice.
Actually, it's the Algerian dialect. It's between
Okay.
French, Arabic, Spanish.
Okay.
It's a mix of everything.
Okay. All right. Cool. 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 It sounded very nice, like I said.
Thank you, thank you. So let's start easy. Many individuals are familiar with your work in DC, your independent series like Infidel and The Good Asian. However, there are many who are unaware of the actual beginning of your career. I'm one of them. So, what is your story?
uh,
How was your childhood?
oh, my child. Oh, we got to go all the way back. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I was born in New York and grew up in New York and New York, New Jersey, Boston, sort of Northeast America. And in that, at the tender age of 12, my parents said, "Hey, we're going to move the family to Thailand for a year." And then we moved there for a year, and 1 year became 2 years, became 3 years. And me and my sisters were like, "Oh my God, I think we live in Thailand now. I think they just decided to move us and they didn't want an argument." And so now that I had kind of like moved to Thailand without sort of like my consent, I think that led me to become sort of obsessed with American pop culture, with comics and television shows and movies. Kind of with this idea that if I could figure out how they all worked, I might be able to figure out like the person I would have been if I stayed in America. And that led me to fall in love with comics. It led me to become obsessed with television, and but specifically comics. I think because it was cheap, and so I could buy one comic and I could keep reading it over and over and over again. So not only would I know the stories, but I would know the creative teams. I would know like who the inker was and the writer was and all that, because I didn't have the option of buying many comics. And then that sort of obsession with stories would lead me to eventually become an editor at DC Comics, where I worked at DC Vertigo for about 7 years, and then I got plucked and moved out to the West Coast to eventually start and then oversee DC Television, which created a bunch of the Arrow TV show, the Arrowverse, and all that for the CW, and Gotham for Fox, and iZombie for the CW, and then but I had always wanted to write, and so I eventually sort of left DC to sort of pursue my own writing, and that would lead to Infidel and The Good Asian, and I had this weird thing where both of my careers started at the same time, so I was writing television on the side, and I've kind of been trying to spin both wheels sort of ever since, and sort of tell my stories.
Well, well, I ask you about anything. How you can write that much of stories in the same time between the Good Asian and the Sandman and the other work and TV.
Yeah, I am constantly editors. I have an editor friend, and anytime he comes to me, it's like, "What's your schedule look like?" It's like I'm on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but I think I'm okay right now. And he's just like, "You're always on the verge of a nervous breakdown," and that's kind of how I do it. I'm constantly like, "Oh God, this is all gonna fall apart. This is all and things have managed to work out, but I'm always convinced it's not going to in about a month.
Mhm. So let's start chronologically with the Amphida,
Yeah.
released in 2018 by Image Comics. I
Sure.
saw there is a French edition actually, not an Arabic one yet. The
Oh
the
yeah.
the, the series received a critical acclaim. You won a lot of awards with it. What inspired you to explore the horror genre while incorporating themes like racism, Islamophobia, loss, a lot of serious topics?
Yeah, I think for me, what originally started was around 2008, and we had just elected a black president, and we felt really good. America felt really good about itself that we had kind of licked racism in the bud and all that. But meanwhile, Islamophobia was sort of spiking kind of through the roof, and so it was this interesting dichotomy, I thought at the time, where Islamophobia was on the rise, and yet we thought it wasn't connected to racism somehow. And so I wanted to have that conversation was interesting to me. And not only that, all the conversations me and my friends were having surrounding race at the time were interesting to me. But it wasn't being reflected in any of the pop culture I was consuming. So the idea was to sort of take my love of horror movies and take all these kind of conversations. And for anyone who doesn't know, Infidel is a haunted house story about a Pakistani American Muslim woman who moves into a building, who lives in a building with her and her multiracial neighbors that's haunted by these ghosts that feed off xenophobia. And so it is a way to, it felt like a way to take sort of the classic haunted house setting and use it to talk about all this other stuff that I really wanted to talk about. But because it was a horror comic, I really wanted to be scary too. So one of the things I try to do with all my books is that even though they try to be about other things, they're very, very much committed to the genre that we're in. So if it's a horror book, I want it to be really scary. If it's a crime noir mystery, I want it to have a twist and turn mystery that you can't figure out. So all that's really important to me. But I do want it to be talking about other stuff as well.
I'm really curious. How was the reactions of the Asian community or the Islamic community after releasing or reading Infidel?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I actually have to think. I can't remember if it's fun when you sort of say the community. I can think of specific people here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of the entire response at large, but I don't know if I can think of just like the Asian community or the Islamic community specifically and how they responded to that. I had a lot of really great conversations with different Muslims while the book was sort of coming out. A lot of which was educational. I think there were some people who were initially put off by the title of the book. But then overall, once they read the book, I've not received any people telling me that they didn't like it or anything like that. I'm sure they're out there. Don't get me wrong. They just haven't taken the time to reach out to me personally. But yeah, so that hasn't been, it's funny. For so many of my books, like, The Good Asian being an example of that. I can think of Asian people who have responded to the book. I don't know if I know what its response is from the Asian community in general. Maybe that's just the way I process things. I'm not sure. So, yeah.
Speaking of The Good Asian, actually, I discovered your work by The Good Asian, and then
cool.
Go back to Infidel and discover your other work. Before we talk about The Good Asian in details, can you break down the historical background or the event you mentioned in the comic for people like me who aren't from America or have Asian background?
Sure. I mean, and the truth of the matter is a lot of people in America and with Asian backgrounds aren't aware of it as well. But from 1882 to 1943, there was a ban on all Chinese immigrants coming into America. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Ban, and it's kind of what the American immigration system was based off of, was built off of the origins of that ban. And then Asians and Arabs weren't allowed to immigrate into America until 1965, and this was the idea that and even though there was a ban, it wasn't a ban on all classes. It was there were specific groups that were allowed in and other specific groups that weren't allowed in. Like if you were a scholar, you were allowed in. But I think if you were
Arab,
merchant, Arabs you could, but merchants I believe could, but laborers couldn't. So to me, this idea that between 1882 to 1965, there was prohibitions on the types of Asians and Arabs that could come into America were fascinating. And we didn't talk, and I didn't know about it. I had grown up in America and I hadn't been taught it in school or anything like that. So that was sort of where the book, I wanted to do a book that talked about that. And then around that same time, in the 1930s, it was very popular. Charlie Chan was very popular. Mr. Moto was really popular. Mr. Wong Detective was very popular. These Asian detectives, these Asian crime solvers were a very popular sort of subgenre. Charlie Chan was enormously huge all around the world. So it was fascinating to me that there were those stories happening at the times where, technically someone like that probably couldn't have immigrated to America, wouldn't have been allowed in and allowed to stay here. And so that's what led to what The Good Asian would be, which is sort of a genre I call Chinatown noir, about one of America's first Chinese American detectives coming into San Francisco Chinatown in classic noir fashion, stumbles on a murder, stumbles on a conspiracy. But really, it's about that generation of Chinese who kind of grow up knowing that their parents, that people like them were banned from entering the country.
Now that you put your story over there, you told the story of Edison. It's a good idea to take a step back and reflect. Do you hold the view of that all the detective story nowadays share a common structure or style? Second question, was that the reason behind your decision to write a story detective that are more mature, touch more on important topics like racism and explore also some cultural aspects?
I think for me, I don't know if they all have the same style, but I wouldn't say all crime books have the same style, because I know when I was writing the Good Asian, I was specifically trying to hit a very specific style, which was that Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, hard-boiled noir, gumshoe detective style, and that was what I was trying to hit. Now, having said that, trying to hit that target, it did feel like there were a lot of perspectives and realities that wasn't incorporated in that framework. And I like that framework quite a bit. I love all those noir stories and all those tropes. So for me, the interesting thing was using the trappings and the tropes of noir and using it to explore what life was like for Asian Americans, for Chinese Americans in the 1930s, and as a way of talking about what being Asian American is like now. I think that answered your question. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So Edison, the main character, is such a complex
Okay.
character. Draw inspiration from another character's name named Charlie Chan, who I think appeared in the first time in the 20s. Beside that, are there any influences such as movies, music, comics? Because I was thinking about Batman while reading actually the Good Asian. Yeah. Do you think, Wula, you can tell me that the inspirations that played a role in shaping your creative process in the series?
I mean, there are a ton of characters that that influence. I read a lot of Raymond Chandler, so obviously, all noir has an influence of Philip Marlowe in there. There's a little Ross MacDonald in there. There's the Continental Op, Dashiell Hammett's. One of the things I found, Philip Marlowe and Raymond Chandler's writing has been so homage to the point of parody. It is hard to write anything approaching it without making it sound like you're doing a parody of it. And so for me, looking at the language of Dashiell Hammett and what he did with the Continental Op was a way of saying, oh, this feels hard-boiled noir of the period without turning into like a Chandler pastiche. So that was a big influence. Henry Chang wrote a book called the Jack Fu Detective Series, and I took a little look at that. Leonard Chang wrote a book called Over the Shoulder with about a Korean American detective. I took a look at that. There's so many influences. The comics influences on the book are Brian Bendis and Jason Aaron and Brian Azzarello and Steranko and Frank Miller. So there's a ton. It's kind of hard for me to see, there's so many things that are sort of thrown in there. It's hard for me to see where one stops and one ends. But it's specifically the voice of the book and of Edison. That owes a lot to me reading Hammett and his Continental Op stories.
Actually, I think you have a really interesting and different style from a lot of writers that are active now in the industry on Image Comics or DC Comics. Your writing always carries a distinct Thai essence, which I found quite intriguing. It's fascinating to see how it's influenced your work and add depth in your storytelling. As a writer, do you feel a sense of responsibility in presenting or showcasing aspect of your culture? And if so, how do you navigate that within the context of your storytelling?
That's a really good question. I have a tough time talking about sort of what my voice is and what my style. I'll get this from my editors a lot. I just got this from something I turned in that's like, oh, we love the script. It's so you. And like, I don't know what that means. I'm sure it means something, but I don't actually know what it is they're picking up when they say it's so me. I do know when I'm writing about sort of like, a lot of the stuff that whether it's Infidel or The Good Asian or Dead Boy Detectives, a lot of that is me bringing in different aspects of being an Asian American into sort of the stories. And for me, it was a perspective that I just thought was missing, and I kind of wanted to. A lot of the times, what drives me to write something is there are conversations I see happening usually with me and my friends, with the people that I know, that I don't see reflected in fiction. And that is, Infidel was about all the conversations I was having with me. I have a multiracial group of friends who are in New York, and I'm no longer in New York, but we keep up. There are too many texts on the text chain of us talking back and forth about bullshit. And but it's a multicultural, multiracial, multicultural group, and all those conversations we have and the differences of our opinions. I wasn't really seeing that in comics or in pop culture in general, in genre in general. So I wrote Infidel wanting to incorporate those conversations and those perspectives. The Good Asian one was incorporating Asian American, the question of like what being Asian American is, and trying to put that somewhere. And a crime story was a really great place to put that. Dead Boy Detectives came in a little bit of a different way, where they asked me to pitch a bunch of Sandman stuff, and silly, I naively, because I'm an editor first, I thought they were asking for my ideas of what I would do. So I said, like, you should get this person to do that person, this person to do that person, this person to do this. And then I was like, oh, and I could write this with Dead Boy Detectives, Ty Ghost. And then like, yeah, no, that's the thing we want. And I'm like, oh, right, because I'm a writer now, and you're pitching me because you want me to pitch a take. But that it didn't really. And then once that opportunity happened, I was like, I couldn't not do it. So a lot of times, and then it was a matter of like, okay, well, if I have a chance to talk about being Thai, how is it different from being Asian, and how can I talk about something specific that was unique to that? But a lot of times it's about finding conversations that people aren't having, or not having in a certain space, and trying to have those conversations a little bit.
Interesting. Let's talk about DC. I'm a big fanboy of
Okay.
DC. I like the Watchmen. I like Superman and all
Yeah.
of other and I like the Sandman universe actually.
Oh, cool.
You wrote the Sandman Dead Boys Detectives.
Yes.
It's a series.
Yeah.
What is the sensation of breathing new life into a storyline from the Sandman universe?
I mean, it was just, for me, it was just an honor. Like, I feel like every writer I love does something. It's always going to be Vertigo to me. So every writer I love does something at Vertigo. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Dead Boy Detectives were created by Neil Gaiman and Matt Wagner, actually. So like two comic book greats. And it's about these two boys who died almost a century apart, who are best friends, who are ghosts that solve crimes. And they're kids, so they're not really good at solving crimes, but they love to play to solve crimes. And in Dead Boy Detectives, they meet up with the world of Thai horror, which in the Thai culture has a bunch of really crazy, really gruesome ghosts. It was my fascination with how messed up Thai ghosts are. So to have like these kids kind of bump into that world, to me, I thought was a lot of fun. But the chance, Sandman is like one of the best modern mythologies. It's certainly the most inclusive modern mythologies. The whole point is that it touches on every conceivable culture and mythology in the world. So I don't know. I think getting a chance to like play in that, and then also James Tynion was doing such a great run on on the Corinthian book, on Dream Country, or Nightmare Country, excuse me, Nightmare Country Glass House as it's called now, but Nightmare Country. And so getting to do a story that, because I never really gotten to work that way before, where I got to, take a subplot that he had further along in my series and then bring it back to him. But meanwhile, both of our books are talking about both our books. I just thought that was a great invitation to play. So I couldn't say no to all those things.
Speaking of your creative process, could you share the details of your initial engagement? Who pitched the idea first? Did the editor or you had the idea first and then pitched it to DC or Vertigo? How was it?
Oh yeah, they came to me. This was very much in advance, and they knew that they were going to bring James was going to do Nightmare Country, and then they had asked me, would you want to do anything in that space, and or what were your ideas, and all that kind of stuff. And again, me naively, I pitched them a bunch of things for my friends to write, and then the very last thing I pitched was like a sentence thing about, like, oh yeah, the Dead Boy Detectives with Thai ghosts. And I think for me, a lot of it too, the irony about how this stuff works is that I knew that they had started writing a Dead Boy Detectives TV show. And so I was like, listen, you're probably going to have to make a Dead Boy Detectives comic anyway, because the shows are going to eventually come out. And then if you're going to do that, like, it might be fun to have them run up against Thai ghosts and have it actually be some real horror in there. And because that's where James seems to be taking the stuff. And they really dug that pitch. And with the irony of comics and television, like when I pitched that, they had started writing the show already, and now the comic has been out and it's been collected, And I think the show is coming this year. I think they finally started releasing trailers for it. But yeah, it's just it's part of the funny way that how comics can be so much faster on TV in that way.
Speaking of the adaptation, Netflix will actually release the first adaptation or the second adaptation of the Sandman universe, that by Detaktfz, this year. Before we go into this question, I want to see your point of view as a screenwriter and as a comic book writer. Nowadays, everything is adapted into something, from a novel, a comic, anything. Did you get any suggestion of adapting both Infidel or The Good Asian? If you did, how could you like the adaptation to be?
Oh, well, so I'm actually adapting The Good Asian for TV right now. We'll see if it finds a network and all that sort of stuff. But I'm working with the studio MRC and James Wan's production company, Atomic Monster, and 3 Arts to adapt it for TV. And so, and in terms of what I would like it to see, we'll see. Like at the moment, it is faithful. To me, the best adaptation, the best pilot adaptation of a comic is the Walking Dead pilot. And the Walking Dead pilot, to me, if you look at the pilot, it follows the same plot as the first issue of the comic, but it adds an emotional story, and that isn't in the comic. And I think that's what the best adaptation should do. Or they're hopefully, the characters and certain aspects of the arcs are all aligned with the comic, but it should have the freedom to add things on top of it, as long as you understand what the point of everything is and what the major central themes and the voices of the characters and the central themes, I think, are the most important thing. And depending on how important those characters are, but I think those are the most important things when you're adapting.
As I mentioned earlier, you write for TV also. There is a difference, but what are the big differences between working on a TV show and a comic? Is it for you? Is it easy for you in TV or comic? What do you think?
I think they're both challenging in different ways. I find comics, and certainly when I read comics are they're both cars in a certain sense. But if you pop the hood, they run on different fuel. So comics runs on conceptual thinking. There are a lot of ideas in comics. Famously, Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison can shoot out ideas. What Mark Waid called it, ideas with rattling off ideas with like shotgun shells or something like that. Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and Alan Moore famously can do a caption. You read that caption, like, oh my God, you could do a comic book just about that one caption. And you can do that in comics because the reader controls time when you're reading a comic. You can stop and think about that and then continue. And what that means, I think, is that a page of comics is actually denser than a page of a script, a telescript, which is a minute on the screen. So as a result, one of the things because of that, I think comics can have the potential to be more dense conceptually, whereas television, because you have actors and you have music, it runs more on emotion. And sometimes you can say emotion and character, but I think we've all watched enough television where characters make choices that are completely out of character, and they do it because they want these big emotional moments. So I think it's more just on emotion. And so when I am working between the two, I'm constantly toggling about, part of writing for each medium, I realize, is realizing what the capabilities of being very surgical, what the capabilities of that medium is. So comics, a common problem I think comic writers have is they overload their comics with too many ideas. At the same time, though, one of the things I think I see when I see a TV writer write comics is there's not enough ideas to sustain the page. So it's knowing like exactly how much, and it's a little bit of experience of knowing exactly how much a page can hold of information and conceptual thinking a page can hold, and how much emotion it can hold. And similarly for television, when I'm working on TV, I'm constantly thinking emotion is easier, and then I'm constantly thinking about like, am I overloading this with ideas? Is that actually going to distract from because the reader can't control time in a TV show or a teleplay? So to me, those are the big differences.
Interesting. Let's go back to Netflix. Actually, last time I interviewed Hisco Hulsing, the director who made Undone and the cat episode and the Sandman show, the animation.
Oh yeah.
I asked him about if you had the occasion to or the opportunity to make or adapt any story of Neil Gaiman Sandman universe, what that will be. And I'm curious to know the response of the same question for you.
Oh my God, any I mean, I think I don't know if that's a fair question to ask, because I feel like the answer is you just want to adapt all of Sandman. Like, you just want to adapt all of Sandman and just let it go. I don't know, because Sandman works as such a Sandman. Sandman works as such a whole, you know. Like, I don't know if you. Yeah, I don't know if I could just pick and choose like that. I just want the whole thing adapted.
So let's go to the collaboration aspect in the comic book industry. You have collaborated with a lot of great artists, great visual artists and inkers. What is your point of view on that collaboration between a writer and a visual artist? How that works?
I mean, at the end of the day, what I think is, you will read. I think Todd McFarlane said it best, where it's that I can, how to say it, like, I can't. Oh God, how did he say this? It's something like, I can sell a comic book. I could sell a comic book. I can sell a comic book drawn by Michelangelo, but written by my cat. But I can't sell a comic book drawn by, I don't know, some random guy off the street. But it was something like, but I can't draw a comic book. I can't sell a comic book drawn by my mom and written by like the best writer in the world, written by Ernest Hemingway, but drawn by my mom. I think it's something, I don't know the exact quote, but it's something like that. And I think there's a lot to that. Like, when by the comics that I do, so many times they're original comics. Oddly enough, my job is the last thing. In a weird way, it is not a writer. It's not the writer who gets someone to buy a first issue of his comic. You know, if you've never heard about that comic before and you're in the comic book shop, well, you probably picked it up because of the cover, and then you probably flipped through it, and then you probably liked the art, and then you brought it home to read. And if you buy issue 2, then the writer has kind of done their job. But actually, the whole purchase of purchasing that issue 1 has something to do with the writer, but it's almost nothing to do with the writer. It almost has everything to do with the artist involved. And the writer's job in those particular cases is giving the artist a field, a playground to sort of do their best work. And then only after they've bought the comic do they actually read the comic. And so as a writer, it is more that, like, I'm more, issue 2 sales are what I do. Issue 1 sales are all based on my artist. And so I think it is a little bit of knowing that when you're writing a comic, that you can tell the best story in the world, but if the art isn't good and compelling, no one's going to pick it up and take it home. And that's the real job.
I agree with you, because sometimes I buy the comics just by liking the cover and not knowing the story or the plot. So do you think covers actually sales more than writers do?
I would say so. I think, like, I think there's like, I think writers, and again, there are certain writers who have reputations that sell comics. But I actually think writers sell issue 5 and issue 6. A good writer will keep a book going. But they might not be responsible for initial sales. I look at something like a great book is what Willow Wilson and I think it's Marsha. I actually don't know how to pronounce the name of the artist, so forgive me. But that book, Poison Ivy, I think if that was a issue mini, it probably. But I think the reason why that book kept going and is so as successful as it is because Willow is such a great writer that people might initially be coming in for the covers. I mean, and for me, I was coming in for Willow. So I think people are coming in for Willow, but I think a lot of people are coming in because of character and honestly because of those covers. And they're sticking around because Willow's just telling this really great story. And I think that's part of, every piece of a comic helps sell that comic and is help part of the experience of reading that comic. And so all of it brings people to the table.
I had the privilege to interview a lot of artists that work in the golden age and the silver age.
Mm,
I always ask them about the actual situation or the actual writers in the comic book industry. They all it's different. Some of them say they have original ideas. Some of them
mhm.
say there were enough in originality. But I wanna know your opinion now as a young writer coming now to the industry. Um, how was the situation of comic books in America in the last 5 years, let's say?
When you say how was, like, what do you mean by that? How was my experience with it? What is
How was
like
your experience?
what
Of
did
course, yeah, and the
uh
and the whole situation, sales, originality, writers, your connection with other writers. How was it?
I mean, I love comics. I love the community. I've I've been working in comics for 20 years, but only for the past 5 or 6 or so have I been a writer in comics. So, and I love the people in comics more than anything. I mean, I make comics to have a reason to talk to old friends and to make new friends. So that's one of the main reasons. And it's happened to be very creatively satisfying and financially satisfying. So that helps too. Um, I think comics are really interesting. I think you can't like the diversity of content is kind of beautiful right now. There's so many sort of different types of comics. I know that a lot of people have been sort of worrying about the state of the industry, but or the state of the marketplace. But at the same time, I feel like, from the history of the direct market, people have been worrying about the direct market. I am maybe I'm Pollyanna about how comics are doing. If comics are slow, then I just feel like it's 1, 2, 3 good hits away from being great. Like, I know that people were concerned about the direct market like a month or two ago, but now like, Ultimate Spider-Man is doing these great sales. I just read an article about how Thundercats #1 is, like 170,000, copies in pre-orders. Transformers is great. I just bought that new Duke GI Joe book. So I think if you put
Yeah, 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 yeah.
if you put strong talent on on high profile things, I mean, look at Barbie, right? It's like you take someone with a distinct voice who knows what they're doing and you give them a platform to talk to as many people as you can, and a lot of people show up. I do think one of the challenges that's happening with comics is the fact that, there's a lot of brain drain in comics. People start in comics and they go off to other medium. It is harder and harder for Marvel and DC to hold on to talent because, the pay isn't great. The wages have stagnated for the past 20 years over there. And so they have to sort of figure out what they can do to stay competitive with even the smaller publishers and places like Image. So I think those are business challenges. And I think as a result, and a lot of times I think when we're talking about comics, we talk about the business of comics. But in terms of the creative side of comics, I think things are better than they've ever been. I mean, I think comics now are making more of the comics than comics right now is making more comics than I want to read than ever. So I'm very happy with how comics are going.
So we have 5 minutes left. So, Pornsak, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time
Oh,
to join us
thank you.
today. Thank you for your work, your excellent work. Keep going. I will be following you in 10, 20 years. Before we wrap, is there anything you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, so I have a new book coming out called Man's Best. It's Homeward Bound in Space. It's me with the amazing artist Jesse Lonergan, who did books like Hydra and Planet Paradise, and just did Hellboy, Ms. Truesdale with Mike Mignola. I honestly think he's like this one of a generation cartoonist, and his stuff looks and feels like nothing else. And yeah, we're doing a new book from Boom. The final cutoff is end of February, February 26th. It comes out March 20th. It is about 3 emotional support pets who are on a spaceship and the spaceship crash lands and they have to go save their human masters. It's unlike anything I've done because it involves talking animals and it is not horror and it's not crime and it's not about racism. And so, but I really, really, really hope people check it out. It's kind of about what the creatures that we go to, the souls that we go to, our pets do, the souls that we go to when we need hope and inspiration, where they go when they need hope and inspiration. So that's but that's the new book coming out. I'm really, really psyched about it. It comes out in March.
Thank you so much again, Pornsak, and see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon.